The Wes Penre Papers. A Journey Through the Multiverse. The Second Level of Learning. http://wespenre.com. Genesis Paper Number 6, The Shamans of Mu, The Fallen Ones, and Corruption of Wisdom by Wes Penre, Sunday, September 2, 2012, http://wespenre.com. 1. Some initial hidden history behind the continent of Mu. People have discussed the location of the continent of Mu/Lemuria since the day some started suspecting that there had been a highly developed civilization on a huge landmass that today has been swallowed by the Pacific Ocean. I am not going to spend time arguing where this lost continent was located. I am going to present a location which to me seems the most plausible. I think it's fairly safe to say that Mu stretched out all the way to the Americas in the east, and almost to East Asia in the west. When it was destroyed in a cataclysm, allegedly around 11,500 BC, it was engulfed by the ocean and sank. The water rose to a level that it swallowed almost the land all the way to the Andes in the east. Left were only a few islands here and there, which are still there today, filled with statues, statuettes, landmarks, that are witnesses of a long-forgotten time. It is quite astonishing that here on Earth, people can go through a decade or more of schooling without Mu even being mentioned in their classes. Still, it's a big part of the mythology among the Australian Aborigines, the Polynesians, and the Native Americans. Both Atlantis and Mu have also been a big part of the occult tradition, spoken about by, among others, Madame Blavatsky and the Sleeping Prophet, Edgar Cayce. The mystic, Rudolf Steiner, whose teachings inspired the setup of the famous Waldorf School, talked about colonies of the Third Root race who established themselves as far east as the Easter Islands. I think that if a person really wants to know the truth, without letting themselves being biased or having preconceptions, they will find overwhelming evidence for the existence of both Mu and Atlantis. At last, now the Indian government has gone public with that they have started looking under the ocean for a lost civilization. The ruins are there all over the Pacific Ocean, and the Atlantic Ocean if they look for Atlantis. Many of them have been found, and a quick Google or YouTube search should trigger the curious mind. We can't talk about Mu without mentioning James Churchward, who is probably the most famous writer on Lemuria. During his lifetime, he wrote books and held a number of lectures on the subject. Although many researchers today discard some of Churchward's research, much of it is still held as very plausible. On his website, Mark R. Williams talks about Churchward and the continent of Mu, which Churchward called the motherland. James Churchward, in books such as The Lost Continent of Mu, 1931, wrote that the motherland stretched from the Hawaiian Islands to Fiji and from Easter Island to the Marianas. Churchward considered the Nan-modal site on Pohnpei Island one of the 7 sacred cities of Mu. Today its ruins sit on a swampy lagoon filled with mangrove trees. Rising about 30 feet in height, black volcanic stones weighing many tons are stacked crisscross like a child's frontier fort. It's one of the more enigmatic sites in the entire Pacific, yet archaeologists cannot explain how it got there. Mark R. Williams writes further about the feminine principle, which ruled in Mu. Yet most sources claim Lemurians were much more like modern humans, living in an idyllic paradise, largely agrarian with lush forests and an abundance of flowers and fruit trees. Feminine principles of sharing, cooperation, and creativity produced a society virtually free of crime, strife, and warfare. Lemurians were vegetarians and lived in harmony with nature and other creatures, and they had a highly developed psychic and telepathic senses, which were applied in practical endeavors such as horticulture. People believed in mind over matter and were adept at manifestation and other reality-creating techniques. This tradition survives, some claim, in the Polynesian concept of mana and various fire-walking ceremonies throughout the region. Williams is spot on in this section of his article, and is further backing up some of what I have said so far in my papers. The Lemurians, led by shamans and high priests/priestesses, building a Lemurian priesthood, could easily connect with the goddess universe, at least to begin with, until their colonies were infiltrated, and the man-dominated principle started taking over again. I think Williams is also correct when he talks about the destruction of Mu in his great article. He says that scientists disapprove of the idea that a whole continent can sink under the ocean, like Mu did. Still, this catastrophic event, or series of events, actually, which seem to have started already around 35,000 BC, according to some studies is widely supported by mythology in the Pacific region of the world, from Australia all the way to the Hopis in Arizona. A Hopi Indian legend says, many people and strange creatures succumbed in the disaster, but some fled underground, while others set off across the ocean on reed rafts, using the islands, sticking up over the surface of the ocean, as stepping stones. These tales are told by many cultures in the widespread area of the Pacific, each one seemingly independent from the other. An esoteric group which is mentioning Lemuria quite a lot in their teachings is the Rosicrucian order, particularly the San Jose Lodge. They say that the destruction of Mu started with volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and the collapse of subterranean gas belts. Magnetic waves began to move around the globe, which made the continent sink. It didn't happen from one minute to another, and fortunately there were those who were proactive and hid much of its wisdom inside crystals, and likely in the crystal skulls that have been found in the area and are said by some have belonged to the Aztecs and the Mayans, which would be post-Lemuria. Interestingly enough, like Williams points out, America's oldest human artifacts have been found on Santa Rosa Island off Santa Barbara, dated around 25,000 BC, which corresponds pretty well with when the continent of Mu was still existing. Mu eventually, just like Atlantis, sank into the ocean in the deluge. 2. The religion of Mu. David Icke says in his book, Children of the Matrix, that in both the Lemurian and Atlantean societies they worshipped the mother goddess, the serpent goddess, and her serpent son, Ea/Enki, often represented by a bull. Ea, however, is not the only god who is represented by a bull, which is also the symbol for the constellation of Taurus, in which the Pleiades is located. It is known, and has been mentioned in many places, that Ea spent quite some time in the Pleiades, and this may very well be the reason why he is sometimes connected with bulls. Otherwise, here on Earth, the bull is a Pleiadian symbol. Not only was the mother goddess religion practiced almost everywhere during the Lemurian era, but was then spread further west to today's Asia Minor and Europe, which is now Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, and Crete. There, temples were built to praise the Queen of the Stars. The most famous is the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus in Turkey, one of the world's 7 wonders. Looking at the structure of this temple, we can clearly see that humans, no matter how skilled they may have been and however hard they worked, they would never be able to build with such precision. This was a temple constructed by the gods, who had the proper technology. That's quite a safe observation. At that time there was a secret society in existence, built in the ordinary Syrian hierarchical structure, away from the Aryan principle of non-hierarchy. This society was called the Sisterhood of Daughters, dedicated in worship of the goddess Hecate. Interestingly enough, at that time, dogs were sacred animals, sacrificed to Hecate. Dogs are of course symbolically connected to Sirius, and by sacrificing these animals to the Queen of the Stars, the Syrian overlords sarcastically paid tribute to the goddess, whom they once served but now despised. Hecate was truly another name for the mother goddess, often also served by eunuchs, men who castrated themselves in a distorted form of worship of the goddess. As we've mentioned earlier, in Orion, when presented before the court of the goddess, men address themselves as females in order to connect to the universal energy that is eminent in the presence of the goddess. Here on Earth, this ritual became distorted and misinterpreted, leading to that men castrated themselves to get closer to the divine feminine. Of course, castration didn't make any difference in that respect. In Mu, however, the shamans, high priests/priestesses, and the rest of the tribes, lived fairly isolated from influence by the Syrians and Ea, the Aryan prince. Prince Enlil was busy digging for precious metals and building smaller cities for his slave masters, his Syrian brothers, so they could live more comfortably and be served by human slaves, who had to abide their smallest wish. Ea, on the other hand, dedicated himself to further genetic engineering, both of humans and of plants and animals. Thus, well-programmed humans, more intelligent than the miners, now spread all over the world. Until things were settled and the new humans had built up the right energies for the Dark Lords to take real advantage of, many humans were quite free to build their own tribes and societies. However, luring in the background was always the Aryan/Syrian agenda, unbeknownst to even the highest initiated shaman, to build up divine energies and to create a control structure that would work to rule mankind under one umbrella and collect enough divine energy to challenge the Queen of the Stars. Manly P. Hall, 33rd degree Freemasonry of Honor, who was a great Mu and Atlantis enthusiast, wrote quite extensively on the subject, also inspired by the Rosicrucian, Sir Francis Bacon, who wanted America to be the new Atlantis. He wrote that the most secret rituals of ancient initiation was done underground, in deep cavern, in subterranean crypts, away from the distractions above the surface. They were called the Caverns of the Mysteries. 3. The Multidimensional Lemurians. With a lot more of their DNA active than the common human of today, the Lemurian people soon learned to become quite multidimensional. Free from stress and major outside influences, they developed quite extraordinary psychic abilities. Although the Syrians had put the grid in place and closed the stargates, the Lemurian priesthood could still astral travel, in the beginning only far enough to get to outside boundaries of the grid system, but they advanced with time. If it wasn't for the grid and the lock-in of planet Earth, the early Lemurians would probably have reached the same, or similar level of multidimensional abilities as their ancestors, the Namlu. However, after perhaps thousands of years of shamanic practice, the female shamans, sometimes in conjunction with a male, could break the boundaries and access the 96%, albeit without full potential. This was noticed by the Syrians in the astral, and they fed off the energies, which prevented the humans from reaching their true potentials. The Lemurian people were quite telepathic and used this ability to communicate between each other, which limited their need for vehicles to travel between tribes. They could simply nano-travel. Advanced technologies were therefore in many ways obsolete and not even something the Lemurians were particularly interested in. Instead, they lived close to nature from which they were born, and understood that Mother Earth and the Sun were sentient beings whom they respected at first, and showed gratitude towards, but as the societies declined, they started worshipping. The same thing happened when practicing the sacred rituals of the goddess religion. After some time, the rituals turned into worship of the goddess, including sacrifices, instead of connecting with her and realize they were one with her. This decline created a disconnection with both the elements and the sun herself, and their psychic and multidimensional abilities diminished with time. This process, however, had outside influences, as we shall see. Like Churchward said in The Children of Mu, from the back cover of one of the editions, they were primarily socially a vegetarian, agricultural, outdoor, organic culture that worked in harmony with nature and the land, having little use for scientific technology. Furthermore, he says that there were about 63 million people living in Mu at the time of the cataclysm. For a very long time they lived in a society of relative equality. The shamans, although having more psychic powers due to their training in the sacred rituals and their bloodline, did not use it to control others, but for the survival of the tribe. Therefore, everybody had what they needed in form of food, clothing, and other life necessities. There were no wars or conflicts that went out of hand. If there were disputes, they were resolved within the tribe, where everyone's opinion and version of the conflict was heard, and they could discuss and resolve any conflict that could potentially be long-lasting. The fact that they lived lives relatively free from negative stress, rich on love and understanding, they could live for several hundred years. However, their DNA was differently engineered than on today's humans, which was most possibly the main factor to their long lives. 4. The citizens of Mu, great healers in harmony with Mother Earth. Living in almost perfect harmony with Mother Nature, the people of Mu knew how to heal their bodies by using the living library. Just like wild animals don't hesitate which plants, herbs, and berries they can eat and which ones are poisonous to them, neither did the Lemurians. Their shamans and other sensitive members of the tribe soon learned how to use the library to enhance their health and to cure the ill. They even used psychedelic mushrooms, hashish and marijuana plants to get high and move to other dimensions. Shamans used them all the time. They were planted, and still are, for the purpose of enhancing our consciousness, but in today's world, the governments have been quick to outlaw everything that will make you multidimensional, if used modestly, while the global elite use these substances all the time. If a person was depressed, disconnected from the sub-quantum world, or had a serious disease, the tribe dug a hole in the ground and buried the person up to their chin and let them sit there for a few days, feeding them water, and herbs and vegetables, if the person still wanted to eat. After a few days in direct connection with the healing powers of Mother Earth, the sick person usually got much better, often even cured. In Mu, the coastal regions were quite heavily populated, because they loved the ocean and the animals who lived in it. The Lemurians were vegetarians and didn't eat meat at all, so the animals, either on land or in the waters, did not feel threatened by their energies. Just like the Atlanteans, the Lemurians had a close connection with animals. It was not quite the same strong connection that the Namlu had, because due to the lower frequency of Earth in the Lemurian times, the animals had become meat-eaters and were not always as responsive as during the First Golden Age. Still, the Lemurians had built into their DNA to protect the animals, and that was a heritage from the Namlu. One could see man and ocean animal playing together in the water, people riding dolphins, sometimes even whales and orcas. But the connection between man and dolphin was not only play, they worked together and communicated on a telepathic level. Interestingly enough, when we watch dolphins today, we may notice that they are trying all they can to communicate with us, but we've lost the ability, and they never accepted that. They still attempt to open that kind of communication. Dolphins are much more multidimensional than humans are in today's world, and so are the whales. They are holding the frequency of the planet. Sadly enough, although the frequency of Earth is increasing today, partly due to an increased level of gamma rays hitting the Earth, dolphins float up dead on the beaches. This is a mystery to biologists, but not so much to the metaphysicist. Dolphins are one with Mother Earth, and when she gets destroyed, her helpers, dolphins, whales, and others, won't stay. They will leave the planet and travel through the dimensions to a reality which would much better match their energies, accommodate them, and appreciate their service. In Mu, dolphins love to help humans with tasks and carry things on their backs. They knew the humans wouldn't hurt them, and they knew that by their presence they raised the vibration of the humans they interacted with. This is still true today. 5. Aryan Symbolism in Mu. Another thing which is pretty interesting is the symbolism of the Lemurians. It shows that they were definitely practicing the Mother Goddess religion. One of their major symbols was the swastika, which at that time represented the spiraling consciousness of the Milky Way galaxy, a symbol of the Mother Goddess, figure 6 to 5 below. In the middle of this symbol is the womb of the Mother, with lightning, symbolizing creation of consciousness, spreading out across the galaxy. The particular symbol shown here is taken from James Churchward's research, a symbol he found on one of the hidden tablets. In figure 6 to 6, below, we have the 12 around 1 pattern, which is also a symbol of the goddess, something the reader may recall from the metaphysics papers. Namely, the number 12 represents the 12 universes in a pond, and the 1, number 13, is the number of the Mother Goddess, the Prime Creator, and the Goddess Universe. The Crystal Link website has some additional interpretation as of what the 12 around 1 pattern is. Creation begins as vibrating sounds, lights and colors emanating from a pulsating orb we refer to as consciousness or source. 12 spiraling cones, horns, tones, harmonics, burst forth forming a circle around the source consciousness, connecting with it and each other to create endless grid programs of experience following a geometric blueprint we call sacred geometry. Soul sparks of light spiral from the central source, randomly moving into the grids to consciously experience. The 12 around 1 pattern, 12 equals 1 plus 2 equals 3, or third dimension references physical reality as nothing more than a biogenetic experiment based on linear time to experience emotions. We mark time in cycles and loops following this pattern: clock, calendar, zodiac wheel, alchemy wheel, etc. http://www.crystallinks.com/12around1.html right bracket. The numbers 12 and 13 have been sacred since ancient times, because creation is built around the number 12, and 13 is the number of the divine, the goddess. Then, in numerology, these figures can be broken down and mean something else. This also goes for other sacred numbers. 6. The return of the Titans. Like I've mentioned elsewhere, there were more extraterrestrial races here on Earth during these times than just humans and Syrians, but to keep focused on our story as much as possible, I have just mentioned them in passing. However, some of these extraterrestrials that people see even today, are not so, but actually native to Earth. They were simply earlier experiments in genetic engineering and manipulation, experiments that later were abandoned by Lord Ea and the Syrians, and others before them. This is the reason people see reptilians coming out of caves, or otherwise seen near water. Some of these beings consider themselves being the true owners of this planet, because they were here before Homo sapiens. Most of them still live underground. These, however, are not the races we are going to talk about here. Over the many millennia Mu existed, much was happening behind the scenes, unbeknownst to the Lemurians, who lived their own lives for a long time period. One thing that happened was that the Titans, who had survived the destruction of Old Terra by hiding deep inside the planet, now came back to the surface. They must have had for long studied the Lemurians by nano-traveling, today we call it remote viewing, and saw that they were practicing the religion of the Mother Goddess, and the Titans felt they wanted to be part of that society. The first meeting between the humans and the Titans, the latter large in stature, must have been a shock to the humans. Some of the Titans could be very tall. However, when the humans understood that the giants came in peace and they could telepathically communicate with humans, they were welcomed into the tribes. During many thousands of years, the Titans helped the humans gain more real knowledge and enhanced their abilities to connect with the 96%, bypassing the grid. This could be done by locating the holes in the grid and disappear through them and into the goddess universe while still staying grounded in their bodies here on Earth. They also learned how to bypass the Syrian monitoring system so that those who watched their progress could not detect them. So, in all, with help from the Titans, who unfortunately were now very few in numbers, some Lemurian tribes learned how to become truly multidimensional and how to travel through the dimensions and into the 96%. These tribes flourished and prospered in ways that have not been experienced since then. While interacting with the Titans, some shamans, high priests and high priestesses, and even some regular men and women of the tribes, learned that they were older souls, and not created by Ea. They were trapped Titans and Namlu, who had still been around in spirit when the Syrians locked the planet in and created the entrapment system. These souls were detected and captured by the Syrians, using technology to do so, and threw them into their recycle system together with the less advanced souls, and those of the fire. Of course, both the Titan and the Namlu souls, the older ones, were also of the fire. The Titans, however, at this time did not tell them about the amnesia trap and the true mechanism of how souls are recycled, afraid of the consequences of doing so. Although the Lemurians quickly increased their numbers to eventually reach around 63 million souls, the planet was still not populated enough to be a problem to control for the Syrians when using their technology. Now, when the planet has reached 7 billion people and the grid is full of holes, the Dark Lords have lost their tight control and it's possible to escape from this trap, which will be discussed later, but at the time of Mu, this was very difficult. Although there were holes in the grid already then, a soul of a dying body could be detected with electronic devices set up outside and on the planet, and the soul was being prepared to be recycled. If the Titans would have told the humans at that time, it could have created a riot, followed by a devastating war one humans couldn't win. Afterwards, Even tighter security measures would have had to be taken by the overlords. The Titans most certainly wanted to avoid a warlike conflict, knowing the Syrians, and from have had the horrific experiences with them in ancient days when Old Terra was destroyed. The Titans arrived in the later part of the Lemurian era, but a growing area of Mu took on their teachings and started practicing the religion of the Mother Goddess, quite similar to how it is done in the Aryan Empire. However, Mu was a huge continent, and although it could be looked at as one huge country without boundaries, it still had its tribes, who developed individually. Also, tribes from Mu traveled by boat to the American continent in the east and the Asian continent in the west. Therefore, not everybody had the chance to take part of the teachings of the Titans, and this showed to be devastating for the whole Mu civilization. If further interference hadn't happened, things may have turned out differently, but there was simply not enough time and the Titans were too few to be able to create an impact across the entire Mu continent. It was like hanging on to the last straw, but hope is the last thing that leaves us, the saying goes. It's probably not different with the beings from the stars. There were other giants who had a great influence on the Mu cultures in other parts of the massive continent, and these influences were not always in the best interest of the tribes. This time, the perpetrators were not only the Syrians.